The other day while driving my 2008 Suzuki Reno, I noticed it started to sputter and miss. Under further investigation, I found the valve cover gasket was bad. This is how to bob, and this is how you replace the valve cover gasket. We're going to get in the engine here, and the first thing we're going to do is take off the two bolts on the top cover of the valve cover. Once we take those off, that will reveal the spark plug area, and then we can start to remove the 10 bolts that hold the valve cover on. After I take all the bolts out, I'm going to get the hoses here. There's two hoses in the back on the left hand side as you're looking at the front of the car. Just slide the hose clamps back out of the way, and then the hoses will simply pull off towards the back of the car here. It's hard to see, I'm sure, and just pull the hoses straight off. Next thing I have is my spark plug boots. I'm going to go ahead and pull those out, and you can see they're saturated with oil. That's how I found the problem. What had happened is the valve cover gasket failed and oil went down and fouled out the spark plugs, so I'll need to replace the spark plugs as well. I'm going to put the wires down here kind of out of the way, just kind of moving everything out of the way so I can get to my valve cover and get that removed. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pull this little wire over here out of the way, and there's a little clip behind it that holds the cover for the timing belt on, and I just pull that out and that will release that. There's a plug down here that is held in by a little wire. Now I'm going to push that out with a screwdriver here, and then I'll have to get my needle nose pliers to retrieve that little wire. Once I get that wire out of the hole, I can just pull the plug straight up. It kind of locks in place with that wire. Now that I've got everything out of the way, I can gently pry up on the corner of the valve cover and wiggle it loose, and it'll start to come off here once I get all the edges pulled off and everything that's holding it down off, and it'll come out. And you see the gasket kind of winds around every which way on this particular valve cover. So I'm just going to remove my valve cover and set that off to the side, and then I'm going to suck out the oil that's down in the spark plug reservoirs. You can see quite a bit of oil down in there. As I pull this out, you can see the oil, and that's what's caused the problem with the engine running. So I'm going to have to replace these, but I want to make sure I get the oil out before I put the new plugs in. I'm going to take the old gasket off. Now there's these D plugs here that have to be pulled out. You can see they're sealed in with gasket sealer. I'm going to make sure that I get those out of there. And then on the top of each one of these posts there are O-rings. And it's very important that when I do this, I want to make sure that there's some that are missing. I want to make sure that I count each one, and there's 10 of them. Some of them are lodged in the actual valve cover, and some of them were sitting on the post, but I want to make sure once I'm done I do an inventory and make sure that I count all 10 of them. Once I get that done, I'm going to clean off my valve area where the gasket's going to meet. I want to make sure I get all the debris out of the inside of the engine, and I want to use some gasket cleaner and a rag, and I want to make sure that I get it good and clean. I'll use my razor blade on the area to get it really good and clean. Then I'll use some gasket remover, just spray it on some of the more stubborn areas, and once I get that sprayed on, let it sit for a second. Use a brush in the corners. Very, very important to make sure that the area gets clean so that you have a good surface for the new gasket to seal onto. As you can see, it gets really good with the gasket material remover. So now I've got my gasket stuff all removed and all clean. I want to get my valve cover and do the same thing. I'm going to use whatever I can to get down in there, and now that I've got that clean, I can go ahead and I'm going to use this Permatex Ultra Black, and I'm going to put it on the O-rings so that they'll stay in place when I put the valve cover back on. And then once I get all those in, I can go ahead and put my valve cover gasket into place. Just kind of line it up and start pushing in the valve cover gasket into the area that was just cleaned out. Again, I want to make sure that I had this valve cover good and clean. Make sure that all the gasket area is clean. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my Permatex gasket material and I'm going to smear some along the whole area where the gasket is going to meet. I want to make sure that I get a good seal for the gasket. Once I've covered my entire area, I can go ahead and I want to make sure my D plugs here are lined up. And I can go ahead and put my valve cover back into place. Make sure there's no wires being pinched, hoses are out of the way, and just kind of work it down onto the top of the engine. And I've got to get this wire up on top of the valve. Here we go, because that has to sit right on top there. Once I get that into place, I can go ahead and set the valve cover back on, and then I can put my valve cover bolts back on. Now the specs say to tighten these bolts to 71 inch-pounds of torque, so I'm going to snug each one down just a little bit, and then I'll come back through once I get them all snugged down and tighten them down to 71 inch-pounds of torque. So I just go through and tighten them up just a little bit, and then I'll torque them up to 71 after I'm done. Next thing I have to do is make sure I get all the hoses and wires out of the way. I want to make sure that they're in the correct place so they don't get crimped or burnt or caught up in something where they shouldn't be. So I'm going to put everything back, and then don't forget the little clip here. Use my screwdriver to pry that out and snap that into place to hold the timing belt cover in. Now this plug here, there's a little wire, it snaps back into the plug, and that locks it into place. Once it's in, it'll snap right down into the hole. Just push it down in there, and then I want to make sure my wire's routed out here. Next thing I'm going to do is take my hoses, and those will be real easy. Just push them back on where they go, and I want to grab my pliers and slide my hose clamp back over the hose to hold that hoses in place. Okay, now that I have my hoses all clamped, I can go ahead and lay out the spark plug wires, and I'm going to start with the longest one and work my way back just to get them all lined up. And it's a good idea, if this has happened to you, to replace the spark plugs and put new ones in there just because they fouled out. In this case, the oil dripped down into there and ruined my spark plugs. So I highly recommend replacing the spark plugs. And I just want to make sure all my wires are lined up and snapped into place, so when I put my cover back on, I won't pinch any wires or cause any problems. Once I get the spark plug wires in, make sure everything's all tight. All that's left to do is put the spark plug cover back on the valve cover, and that's real simple with the two bolts, the Allen head bolts. And that's how you change the valve cover gasket on a 2008 Suzuki Reno. This is How To Bob. Thanks for watching.